This video is an update of my recent video on RV winterizing. Is it necessary to use RV antifreeze if you blow the lines with air? And the reason for the update is I had a lot of questions on the water pump, so I'm updating the video to reflect that. As well, the original video was in response to a question that a viewer had on a Nautilus P1 system. I had a lot of comments from people that did not own the Nautilus system, so to include their concerns, I'm going to make this more generic and it's going to go beyond just the P1 system. But first, let's look at the Nautilus P1 winterization instructions so we know how this whole controversy began. In step 5, it recommends blowing out the lines with air at 40 psi. And this is done by connecting the source of air to the city water inlet. But then, beginning in step 9, after blowing the lines out with air, it recommends running antifreeze through the lines. So clearly the instructions for the Nautilus P1 recommends blowing the lines, then running antifreeze through the lines. Regardless if we have a Nautilus P1 system or not, let's see what exactly happens when you blow the lines with air. So we have an air compressor hooked up to our city water inlet, and we're going to blow the lines on the faucet. You can see that after the lines are blown, we still get residual water coming out as a mist. So let's try to understand a little bit better what's happening. Here I have an air compressor, still at 40 pounds, connected to a short piece of transparent hose. Now this hose has had water run through it, then emptied, but let's blow some more air through it just to verify that it is clear. And when we inspect the line, we can see that inside there are still droplets of water. So it's my contention that you cannot remove 100% of the water that's within the hose by blowing it out. Next, let's look at the water pump and how that becomes winterized. This is a drawing of a typical RV water system. Now, of course, this may be an oversimplified version, but this is kind of basically how they work. So when we're boondocking, the water goes from the freshwater tank through the pump strainer and through the pump into the plumbing system. If we're on city water, pressurized water goes through the check valve and also into the RV's plumbing system. The water pump blocks any water from entering the water tank, which would of course overflow it. If you attempted to winterize this system by blowing compressed air through the city water inlet, in the area in red, the area between the freshwater tank and the input to the water pump would still have water in it. It would not be evacuated. One of my previous RVs, a Class C, had almost that identical system, the only exception being a three-way winterization valve. With that type of setup, you could get to the areas that you couldn't get to by putting the compressed air in the city water inlet. However, not all RVs will have such a winterizing valve. With those RVs, your only choice is to use RV antifreeze in the freshwater tank, then use the water pump to circulate the antifreeze through the whole system. In this test, I have a SureFlow Model 4008 pump, which is a common pump in use in RVs and in marine use for that matter. This is a spare pump of the one I have in my RV, and I have the output connected to a hose. And remember, if you're going to blow the lines, the city water inlet is going to go to the output of the pump. And then we have our extension. And let's turn it on and see what happens. And I don't hear any air going through the pump, do you? And just to prove we have air in here, I will release it. And the compressor is cranked up to about 55 psi. So definitely this pump will not pass air. So now we're connected to the input. And if we connect to the input, then we can blow air through the pump. And SureFlow does say that you have to winterize the pump because if you leave water in it and it freezes, it will damage it. Many of the pump installations have this filter. The filter also goes on the input. And of course, if this freezes, this is going to crack too. It's just made out of plastic. Look at all of the valves, fittings, and other items on the back of this Nautilus P1 panel. Do you think there's a chance that water could collect in one of those areas and freeze over the winter? I think the likelihood is pretty high, and that's probably why Nautilus recommends the procedure that they have. Let's see what happens when we initially run antifreeze through the system after we've blown the lines out with air. Did you see that? I'm going to slow motion it again. The first few spurts was water, not antifreeze. This is after we've blown the lines. And I'll also freeze frame for a second or so we can see clear water. Where did that water come from? It came from the fact that we could not get all of the water out by blowing the lines by themselves. That is about as much proof as I can give that, at least for the Nautilus P1 system, blowing the lines with compressed air by itself without also treating the lines with antifreeze is not sufficient. In summary, we must recognize that RV plumbing systems vary significantly depending on the model, brand, and even year of manufacturer. Consequently, what works for one RV may not work for another. Always follow the RV manufacturer's recommendation for the winterization of your RV. If you have to pour RV antifreeze in your P-traps anyway, pumping RV antifreeze in the water lines certainly can't hurt. After all, it's cheap insurance.